why don't we start by you telling us what your role is, Mathilda?
Okay, so I'm here today. I don't know if Mark got to say Cecilia Bradley isn't here. She's unable to make it today. She was the founder of ADEC, the Australasian Democratic Education Community, which is a group of about 20 member schools across Australia and a whole bunch of individuals as well. And my personal role, I am teacher and curriculum leader at Pine Community School, which is a primary school in Brisbane that is a democratic school. We're about 40 years old, so we've been doing this for a very long time. I'm also one of the founders and a director at Humanitas High School, which is a democratic secondary school, also in Brisbane, and I teach there 1 day a week and do a bit of curriculum stuff there too. So I work across those two school spaces, prep to currently year 10. But we're going to 12 pretty soon. So I get to work with lots of people in lots of different ages, which is really exciting. I've been pretty involved with the democratic education community for a good 20 years or so, maybe more. Well, more if you consider I was a student who went through democratic education. So I went to Pine Community School as a student. And so I've come back to teach at that place. And my children also attend both Pine and Humanitas. So I get to wear all the hats. I get to put I tell people I'm putting my parent hat on now. I'm putting my teacher hat on now. So that's really exciting for me. Yeah. And I'm here just representing democratic education to answer any questions people have and happy to chat about anything.
Well, maybe let's start with that. Like, what is democratic education and what was your experience as a child going to democratic school?
Obviously, it was pretty positive because I've come back. And I think that's probably true with lots of people who have a really positive Montessori or Steiner or other experiences in education. It can be something that really brings you back in. There's a lovely question here. What's the difference between a democratic education in Australia? Oh, no, it's gone away because it's on my mobile. Let me see if I can get it back. It was a cool question. Difference between a democratic education in Australia or autocratic or whoa, that's a big question. Let me just start with democratic education from a formal kind of what we in the community talk about. It's really broad. It's a really broad definition, and a lot of Montessori schools might look at these qualities and go, actually, that's us as well. But it's any education or school or learning institution in any way that believes in an equality between adults and students, and believes that everyone involved in education should have a voice to some level in education. So that includes parents, that includes students, that includes teachers. So it's very grassroots, driven by the people who are involved in education having a say in the day-to-day running of things, and also in curriculum and in social and pretty much everything. What is different, it's a really big community, the democratic education community, not in numbers, but in reach. A bit like Montessori, we have schools all over the world. We've got schools in, I think, something like 120 countries have schools that consider themselves part of the democratic education community. Hundreds of schools. We've probably only got 20 or so in Australia, but we're quite active in our region. We're in the Asia Pacific democratic education community and in the international democratic education community. And what you find is that schools are really different. They're doing things really differently. There's, diversity for local context. There's diversity for just the roots of things, schools that have come maybe from a Steiner tradition or a Montessori tradition or a forest schools. Reggio Emilia is a big influence on lots of people. Schools, even within the democratic education, there's sort of people who are really interested in the agile learning movement, for example, which takes a lot from technology and how things are done in a lot of software tech companies. There's a really interesting school, the Brooklyn Free School in Brooklyn, obviously, that they had members of the board who were really big in these agile software learning movements, and so brought a lot of those techniques into education and then set up a bunch of communities who were using lots of those techniques, which is really interesting. We do use some of those in our schools as well. There's schools who come from like a Sudbury tradition, which is really very, very free range, lots of choices, not a lot of requirements. And so we kind of in the community, in the democratic education community, which I'm sure you probably do in Montessori as well to a certain extent, say things exist on a spectrum. Not everybody is, all choices are free, everything is free. And not everybody's like, these are the tiny little bits that you can negotiate, whether you like having a pink or a blue or an orange folder on your worksheet. That's as far as the spectrum can range in choices. What we try and say is be really honest and be really authentic about what choices are available to children and to parents and to teachers. And then those choices are things that we negotiate and we have a democratic framework around. Sorry, I saw another cool question. What is the democratic movement equality doing to enable poor families to visit? Sudbury schools are very expensive. They are incredibly expensive. I'm not personally a Sudbury school person. I don't work in that world. That's the point I'm coming back to a lot is going to be about, it is a diverse community of schools. We have a lot in common and we have a number of differences. Personally, the schools I work in are either low fee paying to the point of being quite a lot of single families, a lot of low income families. Also, my high school is a sliding scale fee school, and again, the majority of our clientele is low income families. Although we do have some high income families, and we're really working for economic diversity. That's a principle that's personally valuable to us, but it's not true of all democratic schools that they're accessible on equitable basis financially. I think in a number of countries it's different, and I think that's probably the same with Montessori as well, in that I'm not a Montessorian. I love Maria Montessori. I've read a lot of her stuff. She's done some amazing work, but I'm not going to be an expert in Montessori, but I know that's the audience here. So I'm hoping you guys will tell me more about what's the same and what's different. So in terms of equity, there are schools in lots of countries that do things very differently. Most schools who operate in the democratic education community are operating as independent schools from government funding. So in Australia, all of the schools, all the 20 schools have government funding, but none of them are state schools. It's not like a Montessori program in a state school or a Steiner school program in a state school where they've access to those kind of funding and therefore don't have to charge fees. So
Why do you think that is, Mathilda? Why aren't there democratic schools in the public system?
I think it's there's a number of factors at play. I think it's pretty out there, some of the ideas for mainstream systems to say choice. Mainstream systems do a lot of great work with choice and voice. They do a lot of great work with letting students have input in various ways. I've gone to and worked in some state schools that are incredibly democratic, with incredibly democratic leaders who listen very carefully to the students when they say, this is how we want it to be, and this is what we want to learn about. But it is confronting to change your power structure and say, well, actually, as a teacher, you have an equal power structure to a student. You can't rely on a natural authority as an adult to enforce your decisions. You have to use conflict resolution. You have to use nonviolent communication. You have to understand different perspectives. You have to use sociocratic methods. You have to find ways for everybody's needs to be met without using power over and using power with. And at the heart of a lot of systems, that's challenging. And for a lot of educators, that's challenging. For teachers coming into our schools, they can sometimes say, oh my gosh, but what if they don't do what I tell them to do? And well, that's okay. You need to figure out relationships first. You need to build those relationships, build that trust. So there's lots of things that need to be learnt by educators working in democratic ways. Unlearned, there's a huge personal transformation journey when you can't just say, do what I've prepared for you, or I'll give you detention.
Because I said so,
yeah. Or the other thing is, the kids will be lovely. Most of the time, the kids are incredibly lovely and polite. Oh, this is lovely, but no thanks. I'm actually building this amazing sandcastle over here and I'll get back to you. And you have to kind of go, all right, let's figure out how your needs can be met, my needs can be met, how I can connect what I would like to teach you with what you would like to do. And there's constant conversations and flowing of those relationships to make sure everyone's needs are met. And in some spaces, that's very free range. In some spaces, they go, no, that's fine. You keep doing your thing and you come when you're ready to meet. And in other spaces, there may be more negotiation around, well, these are the things we'd like to cover. These are the things your parents would like, you would like, I would like. How can we cover them? How can we make them engaging? Flow is important. Time is important. Respecting where the kids are at, but also respecting the teacher's needs in the space. So it's a very big and complicated dance, but it's a lot of fun. I think Mathilda, I don't even know if that was the question. So, I know what your question was. Sorry. I don't tell Mark, please stop me when I'm wrong. Why is there not more in? I think the other thing is Montessori and Steiner have really great, because they can go, here is our book, here is our writings from our person. This is not everything, not the entirety, but this is where our jumping off point is. Democratic education is not one person, one leader, one vision. The whole point of it is actually diversity, complexity. It's very postmodern. There's no one truth. There's no, everybody read this book and you'll get what democratic education is all about. So taking that system and plonking that into other settings hasn't been something that people have been really able to wrap their heads around at this point. We hope that will change.
So if you get all the teachers in a democratic school agreeing on something, then it ceases to be a democratic school. Is that what you're saying?
No, I think we're in agreement most of the time, actually. I think it's just that there's not, there's just a lot more listening to everybody's point of view. Like particularly sociocratic process is really big in lots of democratic schools. We're kind of use it a little bit and we're learning more about it, but like doing around where you'd, in a staff meeting where you'd go, let's everybody reach, and consensus, reaching, like a lot of democratic schools are defined by having meetings where kids make decisions. That's a big factor. In some schools, it is a really Robert's rules kind of like government system with members and votes and majority rules kind of thing. And that's totally fine. That's the tradition they're coming from. But a lot of the newer democratic schools are switching to more participatory democratic processes where you're actually not going to go with something until you get some consensus. And that is everybody agrees to accept that the proposal is not perfect, but everyone's objections are heard, everyone's needs are heard, everyone agrees to say, I'm willing to try this under these conditions. Let's give it a go. And there's no perfect ending in democratic education or in democracy. They're living communities all the time. So you're revising understandings all the time. But I would say that, yes, teachers do agree a lot and students agree a lot. And we try and get more efficient at our practices to get that agreement and go, yep, we've heard everybody's needs. We're all on the same page. Let's move on and try this thing. Let's try this solution to this problem. Sorry, did I miss a question? I think so.
No. Can you talk a little bit about the history, like where this comes from? What's the connection with Summerhill and Sudbury Valley?
Yep. So Sudbury Valley is an American tradition coming out of the Sudbury Valley area. I'm not going to say the name of the guy. I'm pretty sure it's Daniel something, but it's gone from my brain. I've been at school all day. Both, and Summerhill came from A.S. Neil, from his writings, and a lot of people would say, yes, A.S. Neil is a person whose writings we all should definitely follow and read. I'm not personally a huge A.S. Neil person. I like some of his stuff and I don't agree with other parts of it, but I get that both Sudbury Valley and Summerhill come from traditions where the child is valued equally to the adult. The child's perspective on the world is valued equally to the adults. And the two things that I probably will mention, because Cess would mention them and they're fabulous, are freedom and love. And that you actually can't have education without love, without good. And love doesn't have to be, it's good feeling, it's good effective, positive emotions, it's caring, it's unconditional. That's the thing. Unconditional positive regard, if you want a more professional term, but I just call it love. means that you can't actually have children that you teach that you don't care about them as people, that you don't see value and strength and wonderfulness in those people, and that your job is to work to find the unconditional positive. And that unconditional is a huge factor in our communities, and that's something that would have come from both Summerhill A.S. Neil's writing and the Sudbury Valley tradition, is that you can't put conditions on children who are learning things. You can't say, look, I'm only going to value you if you are an A student. I'm only going to value you if you do these activities in this way. The value of you as a person cannot be tied to your performance as a student, to your performance behavior and academically, that you need to grow in love. You need to grow in love and free choices and freedom to make those choices, and that if we can fulfill those requirements, actually beautiful, amazing things can happen. And so both of those traditions do have a lot of that roots in unconditional positive regard, or love, as is much easier to call it, and making space and time for teachers and students and parents to all develop the connection. And that's not just as parents just caring for your own child, but caring for the well-being of other people's children, caring for the well-being of the world and the future and the community, by going, I'm going to make an effort to see people as worthy of care and worthy of unconditional care, and just needing to have their needs met. So there's a lot of crossover with newer things like MBC, and seeing people as just little people trying to have their needs met in a space. I would mention John Dewey if we're talking about history, because obviously everybody's got their thing that they love. I'm a John Dewey person. I love inquiry-based learning and democracy. He wrote a book, which I'm way too tired to remember the time frame of, was in the early 1900s, on democracy and teaching, and that inspired a lot of the earlier democratic schools. I know some of these are contemporaries of Montessori, so, and Frobel, all of those people are drawing from the same well when we're starting Rosso, starting to look more about these children not as blank slates, but actually as people with a lot of things to give and things to offer. And then that kind of shifted a lot with 1960s countercultural movements across the world, where people were looking at new ways of doing things in education as well. And so a lot of the democratic schools in Australia particularly grew from that 60s and 70s movement, and have changed and shifted over time, absolutely. But they grew from a time when people wanted to really examine some of their practices with education. Sorry, I saw another question. Can I just grab that?
Yeah. Andy, do you want to talk about what you wrote? And you can unmute yourself. And I want this to be a free
please
conversation
do.
with
throw
everyone.
it out to me.
So jump in.
Yeah. Okay. No. In Germany we have the Odenwaldschule. The Odenwaldschule is meanwhile closed because of serious problems which came up there. And I think that the time has completely changed. When Alexander Nile started with his school, his idea were great. It was flower power, love, sex and rock and roll, and everything was actually all around. And all this has changed completely. So the democratic movement actually is no more existing actually like it was before. And so also the schools have more and more changed meanwhile. So what you're talking about is very, very nice, actually. It's good. Hubertus von Schönebeck in Germany, Amication, is exactly following the same direction. But also he has problems to set up a school because of the society has completely changed. Because love is no more accepted as love like it was before. So when you are, especially when you are a male teacher, you can get a real whole butt of chicken.
Yeah. So you cannot use the word love, and I obviously I can as a middle-aged woman say, oh, I love my children, they're great, in a different way.
Exactly.
That's why I'm saying unprofessional, a professional unconditional regard, positive regard is a much more acceptable term. I think A.S. Neil, we just have to remember too that he's big. He started Summerhill in 1920s, so he was beyond, like, bit before that sort of. But his ideas really sparked in the 60s when everyone's like, "Oh yeah, I read Neil today," and I'm like, "Ugh." There's a lot of cringeworthy stuff in there. And I think if the democratic education movement continued to stay stuck in 100 years ago, or even 40 years ago, or even 50 years ago, that would be a real problem for us, and a real problem for me personally. I think what I like about it, these questions were coming out about our history, is that because we aren't tied to one particular person, because we're not tied to A.S. Neil, we're not tied to Sudbury Valley, we're not tied to Yaakov, who's one of our probably more prolific writers now, Yaakov Hecht, who is from Israel, and his democratic education cities movement has, like, they have hundreds of schools in Israel that use democratic process. They have really done some interesting work. There's also a lot of good schools in places like Korea, Japan, India, Taiwan, like really interesting stuff happening all over the world. Not huge. We're not talking about, besides Israel, they can say that they've got lots. We're not talking about massive numbers of schools, but we are talking about, I think what you're highlighting is the need to shift and adapt. And I think that's a huge part of what we all do. Montessori, Steiner, mainstream education, democratic education, we all do shift and adapt. And I think some of the tenets of what have been in place since that history, so the tenets of inquiry-based learning, project-based learning, asking children for choices and voices, having respect for children as equals, and making sure that their voices are heard, seeing children as people first, not necessarily as little vessels to be filled up with knowledge and then churned out the other end. All of these things need to still be valued as philosophies, but evolve in how we practice it. I think we're a lot more professional as a movement than we used to be, obviously. And if you don't professionalize and adapt, you die. I think some of the really interesting stuff that's happening is stuff that's coming out of America with things like agile learning, where they're connecting into how people are working in software and tech companies. I have my son actually is a massive coder and codes a lot of games, and the way that creative process works and some of the really interesting ways they adapt with intentionality and using that process, some of the agile learning processes are really fascinating, and lots of the democratic schools are using these tools and processes and trying them out in education spheres and senses. A lot of schools who are doing this practice, mainstream, democratic, otherwise, are building on each other's practice without necessarily going, well, we're a Sudbury school, or we're an A.S. Neil school, or we're a democratic school. Lots of big schools around the Future Schools movement in Australia and also Asia Pacific. So your Green School movement, Forest Schools movement, Agile schools, obviously, lots of the Aero schools, lots of the homeschool co-ops. We're building on each other's practices without necessarily always using the same language and words to describe it. Not everybody would say, I'm a democratic school. We like to, in our small community, because we like to network globally, and that's the word that's used globally. But some other people use progressive school, they use community school, they use alternate school, they use student-led school, child-driven school, all sorts of words get tossed around. It's just a big umbrella that we're trying to go, schools that use these kind of practices within. And yes, I don't think you should talk about like loving your students in a certain particular way. I think that's very unprofessional.
Well, freedom and love, I guess, are two concepts that Montessori talked about. Those were, for two of her prerequisites for
absolutely
education to be child-centered. Love being like looking at the child as the teacher of humanity in that sense. And freedom, I guess she had a somewhat different idea of freedom, giving the child choice. But I know some Montessori teachers who would say that a Montessori classroom is not a democracy, and that the teacher should always be in control of the classroom. So it's freedom comes with responsibility, and that could be a spectrum where responsibility is on one end and then freedom on the other, and it can be somewhere in between. But
I think
I
that's
guess
very true in democratic schools. The spectrum, and I mean, A.S. Neil is not my favorite person, I have to say, but he would write that there's no freedom without the difference between freedom and license stops at the ability at the end of your finger touching somebody else's nose. That there's a difference between freedom, making your own choices within a space, and license to do whatever you like. It's not a license to do whatever you like. It's freedom to make choices for yourself. So he talked a lot about freedom, not license. And where your own personal freedoms stop is when they impede on somebody else's ability to have freedom, their ability to learn, their ability to have a beautiful community and a calm community and a loving community. So, yeah, it is definitely a spectrum. And there are I think the only point of difference would probably be in how the role of the teacher is viewed and how much the teacher, because there's a lot of commonalities, and there's a lot of people in the democratic education world who have taught in Montessori schools, are Montessori trained. Pine, for example, which is 40 years old, where I work, was set up in the 80s by university lecturers in early childhood, which include, and teachers and parents, and of the founding families, I think 3 of them were Montessori teachers. So it was a strong influence from them, wonderful women that they are, and they continue to have.
Say that, actually, because when I was living in California, I spent I think it was 2005. I spent a day at a Sudbury Valley school, and I think there were 8 of them left, or no, 12 of them left in the United States at that time. And I was really curious, so I asked to observe for a day, and I found that most of the teachers at that school in Concord, California, were radicalized Montessori teachers who'd kind of felt that Montessori didn't go far enough in giving children choices. And so it was such an interesting day. It was really like these children were so confident and just, able to, speak. I didn't see any fear or any, and they made choices about what they were doing all day. One child spent the day basically just playing the piano in one of the rooms, and I observed a meeting, a governance meeting, where the children made decisions about things that even including hiring and firing teachers and who should do what jobs, and everything was up for grabs. There was nothing that was reserved for adult decisions. And as far as the curriculum was concerned, there was a whiteboard in the main room, and children were asked to sign up if they wanted lessons from teachers, or if they wanted to go out and they wanted help in facilitating a going out activity from one of the teachers. And I asked the teachers, like, how is that working? And a few of them said, well, it did work much better before they introduced digital technology into the school. And there were shelves and shelves of books, but a lot of the kids that I remember that day, they were spending their time playing video games. And some of the teachers said, well, we can't really do anything about that because it's their choice. And it used to be that kids spend a lot more time, reading books until we introduced this technology.
Yeah, that's an interesting one that you raised there, because I would argue that the teachers does have a choice, because they need to share their concerns. They need to share their needs in the space too. That it's not actually working really well if the children rule everything and make all the decisions. It's about including each other and valuing each other both as people, and including the teacher going, actually, I've noticed that lots of people are just playing screens all the time, and I'm wanting to find out more about this. Tell me more about this. What's happening? How does it feel for you? What do you need? And then let me tell you how it feels for me and some other concerns I have. What can we do to problem solve around this issue? Screens are definitely an interesting one, because there's definitely a spectrum, and there are people who would say it's totally okay for them to just be on screens for as long as they like, and they'll come to all the other things they need. Screens are probably an example, although it's an interesting example because there's billions of dollars of industry designed to keep our kids on those screens when they may not necessarily be able to make the choices to hop off them themselves. But they're a useful tool. There's some really wonderful communication. There's some really wonderful group stuff happening. There's really wonderful, I can tell you a story about screens if you like, our high school story. So we have this high school that we've started about 2 years ago, and we have probably about 80% of our kids are coming from non-democratic backgrounds. So they're coming from state schools, they're coming from other alternate schools like Steiner schools, Montessori schools, independent schools. They're coming from homeschooling, and they're coming into an environment that is democratic. So they do have choices. They do have a honeymoon period where they think, oh my gosh, I can do whatever I like. And then, oh, I've actually got to do some other stuff to learn some stuff too. But we had some kids who came in and they just really loved that they could play Minecraft with their friends for hours and hours. And for some kids, that lasted a couple of weeks until the teachers started to have some conversations about how they maybe meet their needs in other ways, their curriculum needs, because in Australian context, we are using the Australian curriculum. And so we are trying to make sure that we find a way to cover those in a way that's acceptable for teachers and students and parents, and we're all happy about it. And there's kids who are coming from a democratic education community already. We're like, oh no, we've explored that. We don't need to just explore saying no to heaps of stuff. We want to explore saying yes to heaps of stuff. That's what we're really excited about. Lots of kids coming from more restrictive environments really needed a little period of saying no and seeing what would happen. No, I'm not going to try that thing out. I'm going to try this Minecraft thing all day and see what happens. And then we had kids reaching a point where they actually were a bit bored and were looking for something else. And then we got beautiful, beautiful things happening where other kids were like teaching them how to code, teaching them how to make their own games, teaching them how to use their love of digital learning and technology to make their own mods. And I remember this one kid just like for about 6 weeks doing nothing but screen stuff, and me just going, oh, this is a bit too much, my friend. And him coming up to me one day and goes, Mathilda, I have to show you what I've done. Like, I've changed the code of this website so that like I've mastered how to change this cookie clicker program that I thought was rubbish, and he knows I think's rubbish, and I know how to code it now so I can win instantly, and look what I've done. And I'm like, mate, look what you've done. Look at this quadratic equations, look at this code, look at this stuff. And it sparked for him a whole revolution of maths and beautiful coding and beautiful stuff. And then over time, he's now doing more other stuff. He's doing more English. He's doing more art. He's doing more history. He's balancing his day a bit more, but he needed the time to explore the thing. He needed the time to trust us. The relationship has to come first. He needed time, and time and relationships are big factors in all schools. I think maybe what we just do is allow our staff and allow our students maybe a little bit more time than others until we get there. We try and tell our kids that, you know, this life thing is not a race. It's not a marathon. It's a journey. You don't have to get it all at once. And what happens in a lot of democratic spaces is that learning flows, and this rhythm thing, it happens in lots of other spaces too. Learning flows in seasons and in rhythms. And so there are times when they're really up and they're really super into stuff, and they might be doing heaps of something, and then that's done for a little bit, and they're having some downtime, and something else will spark and something else will flow. And so we're playing a lot with those flows and those rhythms by giving them time to explore them when they're really into it, and to really just go, yep, we'll put that other stuff aside. We're right now, let's bring everything into that Minecraft. Let's build your Julius Caesar's palace in Minecraft, and let's teach you how to code on all your mods. And let's do your writing in Minecraft, and let's do your spelling through learning to chat with people online and make sure that your spelling isn't embarrassing to you. So that building around interest in projects.
It seems like there's a lot of time in traditional classrooms that is spent on control. And if you take away the need to do that control, then you've got a lot of time that you can
do. And I mean,
saying yes.
Yeah, there's we used to always give an analogy of watching kids our kids, our crazy little wild, beautiful bunch of kids at the swimming pool, because our philosophy was go and we'll have some fun together. We'll go to the pool, we'll all swim, we'll play lots of games. The kids who want to learn how to do formal strokes are going to do that with the people who we know are qualified swimming teachers, but not everyone has to do that. Other kids are just, they're all proceeding at their own pace. They're all enjoying being in the water. And we're swimming in the pool every week. And this other school comes along, which there's a lot of wonderful things going on, but they get there and they line up in their swimming togs and they all take a turn and they all swim exactly. The teacher gets in the pool, they say they swim exactly 10 meters to the teacher, turn around, swim out, go to the back of the line, and they do this for 60 minutes. So each kid actually gets 2 minutes of pool time, and they all have to swim 10 meters, even though some kids cannot swim 10 meters and some kids could swim 200 meters easily. That was the swimming lesson for this school. And we just kind of looked at that as a bit of an analogy to how differently we look at time. We're not going to waste anybody's time going, you are keen to swim 200 meters, but I'm only going to let you swim 10 and then back to the line you go. Time is so precious. Let's not waste it like that. And let's have a lot of fun. Let's just be joyous about our days and splash around a lot. Yeah, sorry. Somebody asked me a different question.
Yeah, it reminds me of this New Yorker cartoon that I saw many years ago, where you've got two fish swimming by, and they're looking at this group of fish nearby, and all the fish are swimming in different directions. And one fish says to the other, "Oh, that's a Montessori school."
Yeah, I can see that. I like that.
What do you think an ADEC school would look like?
I think it'd be similar. I think there'd be a lot of fish swimming in different directions, but I think there'd also be a lot of time when the fish all sit down and have to talk to each other about which direction they're swimming in and figure out if anybody's annoying anybody else by swimming too far away from the group or bashing into people with their fins. Or so there's a lot of time spent on that community, learning to learn together in democratic schools. I think that's something that across the board is, like, even in the schools with a lot of freedom, like you described the quite radicalized Sudbury Valley schools, they still really value that governance meeting. They still really value the coming together and going, how does this community function? Who does the jobs? Who cleans up the dishes? Everyone cleans up. Everyone takes care of keeping the space a community. And I think there's a lot of emphasis put on that, on time to be learning how to be together and to human together, to be humans together. I know that's true in a lot of Montessori schools as well. I think I've only done maybe 1 day or 2 days relief work in my life in Montessori schools, and they were in kindergartens, and they were beautiful spaces, really loving, warm spaces. One thing I noticed that's probably a point of difference, and I'm not the expert in any way, is probably more focus on collaboration and cooperation that was different to the space that I had seen was very set up for lots of kids doing things quite individually and maybe 2 or 3 kids working together, but like limits on how many kids could be in a space at a time. Whereas we probably work a lot more with, well, obviously we're not going to say this space is only for 6 kids. If there's 10 kids who want to do it, we just find a way to make 10 kids do it. And if 2 kids want to do it, we find a way to make 2 kids do it.
So more emphasis on collaboration at that age.
Collaboration is big in most democratic schools. Being a part of a community and connecting with other people is really big for lots of, and I mean, it's big in mainstream schools. It's big in lots of schools. I'm not saying it's not big in Montessori schools. It certainly is, I'm sure. But it just might look a little bit different.
But this is actually not existing in Waldorf schools at all.
Right.
In Germany, we have a huge criticism on Waldorf schools that they are actually preparing the people for fascism and Nazism.
Right.
They are ultra conservative people. You see this also on the evangelical movement, like Hillsong or Bethel and so on their haircuts, which actually tend to the Waldorf haircuts. And when you compare them, they are pretty much the same, actually, like during Hitler time. Or when you go here to Thailand, when my mother came here, said, "Oh, Andy, it's terrible." And I said, "Why?" I said, "Well, I see the brown trousers of the teachers, the scout uniforms, what they have here, the brown short trousers from the boys when they're running around, the long blue shirts and then brown shirts from their scout uniforms, from the girls, the bridles down here too, and then so on." She said, "This is exactly what how I grew up during Hitler time." And there is no democratic, actually. There is no democracy. It's a principle, follow the teacher. When the teacher jumps out of the window, the students will jump behind. There is no teaching of critical thinking at all. It's either you believe the teacher and follow the teacher, and that's it. And this is completely different in a Montessori school.
Yes.
In a Montessori school, you will have a student who comes to you and says, "Teacher, you are completely wrong." And he will prove you that you are wrong. And he will show you that you are wrong. Yeah, and he will discuss.
Yes, had that a few times myself, actually, with some students.
Yeah.
I always say that that's the mark of a it's like a rite of passage for, I mean, obviously I'm saying a rite of passage for a democratic educator, and it's probably true for a Montessori educator too, that's a wonderful rite of passage that you need to go through, where you know that you're wrong, or you admit that you are wrong, and you make a mistake and you apologize for it, or you make amends for it, or you go, yeah, actually that wasn't, because teachers are human too. You know, they're not infallible.
Mathilda, can you give an example of a time when you really had an investment in doing something with a group of students or a class, and they were just like, "No, we don't want to," and how you dealt with that, and how you get, like, what comes to mind, the question that comes up for me as a Montessori teacher is, how do you get anything done in an environment?
It's, you know what, the first few times it happens, you're like, you can take it really personally. You're like, "Oh God, guys, this is awesome. This thing that I've put all this effort into, these hours of planning that I've put into this beautiful experience, that I've made my resources and I've set it all out." And you're like, "Yeah, nah, I'm just going to keep playing in the sandpit." First few times it happens, you can kind of go, "Oh, this is just a bit awful. I'm not really loving this." A teacher that I worked with, who I valued quite highly, he teaches future thinking at the University of Sunshine Coast now, who, when he worked at Pine, a democratic school, he would say, that's how you become a good teacher. You know, if your lesson is tanking and everyone's in the sandpit, actually, what's wrong with your lesson? What didn't you do? It's about relationships. So I think most teachers in most schools actually use relationships to get kids to join in with what they're offering. I think most teachers, you know, there's kids do things, they learn things for a number of reasons. One, because they want to, because they're really fascinated and they think it looks interesting, and they're really excited to learn that. That is a really great reason to learn things. A terrible reason, but one that exists, is because that's just what happens. They're expected to sit there and do that. There's a negative consequence. They'll get detention. They'll get a bad grade. Their mum will get mad at them. They don't want to disappoint. There's fear. There's a fear there of doing the wrong thing, of going against the tide and the group. So they do the thing, even though they don't really want to, because of the negative reason. And then there's because they might not love it, but they actually care about the person, or think the person's all right, and they'll give it a go for that person because that person's not leading them astray too often. I think what we do in democratic education is we need to be really careful with that power, that children naturally give adults that power all the time. All children naturally give their power to adults and say, I trust that you're not leading me astray. I trust that you're not wasting my time. I trust that the activity that you're giving to me is of value, and I'll give it a go because you're a teacher, because you're an adult. So for me, I had to unlearn not using that against them. If something really was terrible and not working, I had to say, guys, let's just abandon ship on this because it's not working and you're not loving it. It's not working out the way. And I also had to learn that something doesn't have to work for everyone to be a success. And that's a big thing in our kind of spheres. I could do a lesson, 10 kids will go through it, you know, 8 of them are loving it. 2 of them aren't really into it. They'll stay because I've asked them to, or because their parents want them to, or because they want to. Then they'll drift away. But another lesson might happen and those kids won't stay. And I've got one kid, but that didn't mean that wasn't a successful lesson. If me and that one kid jammed and got those multiplication arrays and we just loved it and we did that problem solving, and that was a light bulb moment for that person, that's actually considered in democratic education to be a great moment, a great lesson, because every child matters. And if I don't have to worry about making sure that all 10 of them get that concept at that time, I can just enjoy the moment with me and my one kid, you know, with our little moment of our multiplication arrays or whatever it is, without necessarily stressing about everybody all the time loving it. So you asked me about when things bombed, and I'm so many bombs. It's just about learning to go, nah, let's cut it and go play on the water slide. But so I think you learn to be a better teacher.
Yeah. How much decision-making power do children have in Australian democratic schools?
It's different. It's different
running the whole
schools. Because in Australia, most schools who are democratic schools are getting government funding. So they're usually using a CARA. They're usually using, what we kind of do is say, we really love that we don't have a Montessori curriculum or a Steiner curriculum. We have to use a CARA, or so we love the fact that a CARA tells you you can use any pedagogy you like, any pedagogical practice you like, but these are the outcomes, these are the journey. Most of us, our documents look like we want our children to cover the same things. Of course, we want them to learn to read and write and do maths and learn history and science. All of those things are great things. I pick up the curriculum and there's nothing in there that I don't want my children, my own children, the children I teach to learn. What I don't want is a prescriptive use of their time that says you all have to learn it at age 5, even though you might be interested in this not till age 7. You know, you all have to do Roman history when you're 13, even though you might have a kid who loves the Romans when he's 8. So we try and multi-age it. We try and follow kids' interests. We try and get consensus for the things that we learn about. Not everybody, in a lot of Australian schools, the units that we study might be, all of them will be based on the children saying, yep, we'd like to do that. And these are our questions about the ocean, or these are our questions about metal, or these are our questions about why does paper rip, or how does paper rip, which is one that I have. Some kid has decided that we're going to learn about this term. How does paper rip? So it's going to be really fun and really sensory. Space, where did the first banana come from? Obviously, we have a wandering wall in my room and the kids just tell me things and I throw it on the wall. Where did the first banana come from? All right, we're going to do that. Now, where did the first banana come from may only hit that particular child, but I'm going to invite all the children to come along that journey with me, and most of them will get something out of it. And some of them will just be like, yeah, that wasn't for me, but I enjoyed that it was Tim's question and we love Tim and he's a part of our class. And I also know that we're going to do unicorns and Pegasuses and what's the difference between a unicorn and Pegasus and alicorn tomorrow or next week. And that's my thing. And I want everyone to come on board when we're doing my thing. So I'm going to give Tim's thing a go so that we can also do unicorns, Pegasuses and alicorns, which we have done as well recently. Mermaids, cannibalistic mermaids that hit lots of my little boys. They really like cannibal mermaids. It's about a journey that tries to make sure you listen to lots of different kids' ideas and voices.
So do you, as the teacher, do you try to pull in elements of a CARA to match the questions that come from
100%. So we just flip it. We just, instead of picking up the curriculum and going, this is the curriculum we teach, we're going to break it down and give it to you. We say, what do you want to learn? What do you need to know? What are you interested in? What is sparking for you right now? And then we go back to the curriculum and go, okay, where does that match? Where does that fit? And we get very, very good at that. We get very, very good at going back to the curriculum and going, actually, it fits beautifully. I had a high school kid who was interested in cops and robbers. She was interested in the idea of robbers and the ethics of being a robber. And so I started to research all these questions that the kids then came up with about. And then I went to the curriculum and I was like super excited because the year 9 civics, even though these kids were year 7, was all about the equity of law and the justice. And then we went to the state, we went to the courts and asked all these lawyers and judges all of these questions about robbery and things. And it was great because I was like, yes, curriculum match. I'm new to high school curriculum, so that's always exciting to me. Whereas I've been teaching for 15, 17 years in early childhood spaces. So I know that curriculum back to front. I know how to match unicorns and Pegasuses to whatever outcomes we need. I had a question. Oh, I love questions because then otherwise I just ramble.
Yeah, it's just from me, Mathilda.
Yes,
Yeah.
cool.
Want to ask it, Alex?
Yeah, just because, I mean, we find ourselves in the same predicament, and I'm sure there's going to be commonalities in your answer, but just about how, in that very flexible and reactive way of teaching, how is it that you record, assess and report? Like, what does that look like? And you notice that I've put assess in inverted commas there, but yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Very similar to you, I'm imagining. A lot of portfolio documentation, lots of photos, lots of videos, lots of audio, lots of kids writing about what they've learned or what I've gone through lots of phases in my work, probably most influenced by Reggio Emilia practices of visible documentation and letting the kids' thinking really be seen and heard by the parents and families and the government as well. We have to be very good and creative in our paperwork back to government to say, yes, we did actually teach them all the things that you wanted to teach. We just kind of did it sometimes in a different time frame. One of the big things for us for reporting and assessment in a democratic space is when kids are simply not ready for some of the push down curriculum that we have in ACARA, when kids are not ready to sit down and learn complicated phonics patterns because they're just actually in a pre-reading stage. In most democratic schools, we're going to leave them in where they're at. We're going to give them lots of tools and scaffold lots of beautiful experiences and foundation, but we're not going to push with big 2-hour literacy blocks to get them reading by the time they're 6 and hating the reading by the time that they're 7, which I see as a real problem with the push down curriculum, because experienced early childhood teachers in Montessori schools, in democratic schools, in Steiner schools, in state schools, they can see where kids are at. They can see the kids who are ready, and you give those ones more, and you see the kids who need more time and more skill building before you move on. That's a really hard thing to do in those early years. What we've noticed with Pine particularly is that they all get there by the end of primary school, but there are a few that you really have to give a lot of time to let them to develop at their own rate and pace. And that's really hard with the reporting and assessment, particularly as it gets harder and harder, and we're asked constantly to do more and to say, why isn't this child meeting this benchmark at this age? So we have to be very, very confident of our research. We have to keep getting research that says, well, actually, no, children learn best when they're following their developmental patterns and they're following and taking a lot of work samples and a lot of to show progress. I think that's what we need to do in general, probably in Montessori schools as well, is not demonstrate mastery of achievement standards, but demonstrate progress and go, well, yes, no, they don't know 44 phonemes, but they know how to write their name and they didn't know that 6 months ago. So it's taken them 6 months, but progress is progress, and that's awesome.
Mathilda, is there a theory of development that's accepted in among democratic educators? Like, I guess that would be a difference with Montessori.
You've got quite a strong theory of when things happen, and the very Steiner is the same. They have a strong periods and theory of. I would say that that's probably a big point of difference for democratic schools, because although lots of schools would probably still look at people like Piaget and look at those kind of frameworks of roughly these things happen at these times, generally a lot of democratic educators believe in diversity and difference in developmental windows and developmental timeframes. And a lot of democratic educators, not necessarily myself, but would believe that there is no missed window. There's no, that you can learn things at any age when you are motivated and supported and scaffolded. So you don't have to necessarily get all this stuff by the time you're 7 or 9 or 10. Obviously, there's common ways of being. One thing, though, I find really challenging with some of those frameworks is the idea that everybody develops at the same rate and time, because that's just not my experience, either working in a democratic school where I notice the variance quite broadly, or also just my own kids and my own experience of that children do develop very differently. There are obviously commonalities, but we don't subscribe to one particular range of development. We use a lot of continuum-based stuff in my schools, obviously, sort of saying this is the range, but yeah, you can be 7 and in this area, and you just need to move on to the next range. Not necessarily you need to be in the 7-year-old range and then move to the 8-year-old or the 9-year-old skills. I think Montessori had some stages. I'm not very good. You have to tell me, that were quite broad categories, sort of stages and an adolescent stage with sort of theory of mind stuff and an early childhood stage. And those would probably sit really nicely for a lot of democratic educators because they're broad enough. But we would also say that we don't necessarily believe all children have to move at those rates.
And it sounds like you've got, Mathilda, within those schools, there'd be a fair amount of collaboration amongst the staff as well, amongst the educators, in discussing where that child is. And
most democratic schools are multi-age schools, and so we draw a lot from multi-age philosophy, and also, well, the schools that I work in particularly, also, even though we're 100 and so odd kids, we have a lot of whole school time because we want all the teachers to know all the children and to work with all the children. So you do have a lot of collaboration, and you do make a lot of time for conversations about where kids are at and where we can move them to next.
How are
so
you
those
doing testing?
Yeah,
So
that's
when
a
you
big
said moving at, so how do you test that a child is here or there? Because in Montessori school, you have a self-testing more or less. Also, yeah, they're managing the materials. It's coming from the materials more or less.
probably more
In Waldorf
observation.
schools, they have a huge problem. The kids have no testing until grade 8, and then suddenly they have to go to the normal school system, and many fail, simply fail. They have worst results.
So we would probably, because we don't have the same sort of structured materials that are self-testing, although lots of schools do use lots of really cool stuff. I love 3-part cards. I'm a bit obsessed with Montessori's 3-part cards.
They're pretty cool.
They're pretty amazing. I always got to have some 3-part cards out. So a lot more focus on self-assessment, I think, than maybe other places. A lot more focus on where talking about your strategies, talking about your skills, talking about where you're at. How did you feel that? What could we do? And because we're not grading, we don't want to grade our children. We do not want to tell them that they are an A or a B or a C. We, for years, managed to get away with not doing any of that. And in recent decades, certainly have had to, because it's legislated. So we give that information reluctantly, and with lots of caveats that this is not rich portfolios. This is not a rich picture of what your child is and can do. And we don't want kids.
You let them self-grade?
Yeah. We've played with that, and some schools have played with that a lot more than we have. We've kind of gone with, this is nonsense in a lot of ways, telling people that you're a B in maths and a C in, or whatever, whatever your 5-point scale is. But in Australia, you have to use a 5-point scale. It is legislated that you have to use a 5-point scale, and you have to report on a 5-point scale twice yearly to parents and to students if you choose to. I personally, as a parent, putting my parent hat on, when that process goes on, I do not tell my child. I do not want my child to know. I do not want my child to start comparing himself to other children and thinking that he is better or worse, or that there's a limit to learning, because there's not. You're at A, you're done. No, that's actually not how learning works. Life is full of learning, and So you keep going. So self-assessment is big, but self-assessment doesn't necessarily work with grading. Sudbury schools wouldn't grade at all, most of them. It depends what country you're in, what you have to do. We love continuums. In Australia, the First Steps continuums are really great. We've always used them. They're really good. Continuums that the kids make up for themselves. We've got this pretty hilarious one at Humanities that the kids made up that's it has the word meh in it, which I love because that's right down the scale of actually I didn't really care about this, so I didn't really do much. It's a meh. That was a meh for me. Meh in my learning.
I like that.
Yeah, it's pretty cute. And up to, wow, this is really cool but really hard. And yeah, meh, like not wasn't really floating my boat. Using the tools that good, so keep looking for tools that work for you. Obviously lots of documentation. That's how you actually, I mean, really, that's how teachers know where their kids are at because they observe them, because they document what they are. Like the Montessori teachers that I know were incredible observational reporters. They wrote every single day after their session about what their kids are doing, and they knew their kids back and forth. And I would say a lot of democratic educators are the same. They know their kids back and forth. They know what new exciting thing to throw out and what thing to kind of not to fix a need or fulfill a need. Definitely knowing your kids. And I think lots of mainstream teachers are also the same. They just aren't given the time to do those things. There's a really good practices. They're really good assessment practices. And, you know, you get a decent teacher worth their salt and they'll tell you where kids are at. They don't need test results or NAPLAN or reporting system. They will be able to tell you what kids know and can do and what they're struggling with and what's next.
Especially if they've got them multi-year, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a big part of it.
Yeah, this has been so much fun talking with you. We can go on for hours, but we're going to have to call it a close. But maybe we'll have you back another time because I've learned so much from listening to you, and it's been really interesting.
It's a bit ranty. I just thank you, Andy in Thailand, for throwing some questions at me. It's really nice to have some questions to deal with. And I do apologize for not having a very thorough understanding of Montessori. I love everything that I've read from Maria Montessori, although I do have to say my thing I find hard is I was trained in theatre studies, so not having pretend play in lots of Montessori sentences is really hard for me. Really hard, really struggle with that. But it's been really nice chatting with everyone. Hope it's been slightly interesting.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks, Mathilda.
Okay.
It's been fabulous. Learned a lot.
And for those who are listening, our Montessori Australia conference in Sydney in October 28, 29, we have Fiona, the president of ADEC, will be speaking about transformation of the teacher in democratic schools. And we'll also have Shelley Davido, who will be talking about transformation of the teacher in terms of Steiner. So we're trying to bring in, perspectives from outside Montessori to broaden our
horizons.
And, and it's been really interesting.